The car rumbled along a dusty dirt road, weaving through dense pine trees under the flickering sunlight. The air was thick with summer heat, but a chilling unease lingered. As the family passed a cattle guard, the youngest boy glanced out the window and froze. There, standing motionless in the shadows, was a figure. Its clothes were torn and ragged, its face impossible to make out. The boy's heart raced, but when he turned to speak, no one else had seen it. The figure stayed rooted in place, its head tilting slightly, as if watching them disappear down the road. The campsite was nestled in a quiet clearing, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the twilight sky. The air was cool, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the forest floor. As the family pitched their tents, laughter echoed softly, but the youngest boy couldn't shake a growing unease. He stood apart, his eyes drawn to the darkening woods. Between the trees, the shadows seemed alive, shifting unnaturally. For a moment, he thought he saw something, a figure distant and still just beyond the edge of the clearing. But when he blinked, it was gone, or hiding. The forest was alive with sound as the two brothers wandered deeper, their laughter blending with the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. The towering trees formed a canopy, their branches casting long, twisting shadows across the forest floor. The younger boy felt uneasy, his steps slowing as the air grew heavier. Then they heard it, a sharp, rhythmic sound. Chop, chop, chop. The boys froze, their breath caught in their throats. The sound was close yet unseen, echoing through the trees. The younger boy's eyes darted nervously, and in the distance, for just a moment, he thought he saw movement. Night fell quickly, blanketing the forest in a suffocating darkness. The family huddled around the campfire, its warm glow flickering against the towering pines. Laughter and the sweet aroma of roasted marshmallows filled the air, but the youngest boy sat stiffly, his eyes fixed on the forest beyond the firelight. The crack of a twig snapped behind him, sharp and deliberate. His breath hitched as he turned, but the trees revealed nothing. The sounds grew louder, closer. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching, each noise cutting through the night like a warning. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting, just beyond the fire's reach. The snapping grew louder, each crack of a twig piercing the silence like a warning shot. The family sat frozen, their laughter gone, replaced by a tense, creeping dread. The youngest boy clutched his knees, his wide eyes darting to the edge of the forest. The sound wasn't random, it was deliberate, coming closer with each step. Then, it stopped. The forest fell deathly silent, the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. Everyone held their breath, the fires crackling the only noise. Then came a faint rustle, a presence just out of sight. Something or someone was there, watching them. The father stood abruptly, his face pale and tense, his revolver gripped tightly in one hand. His voice cut through the thick silence, sharp and commanding. "Get in the truck, now!" The family scrambled to their feet, fear replacing confusion. Twigs snapped rapidly in the shadows, closer and faster, as if something was rushing toward them. The fire flickered violently, casting long, chaotic shadows against the trees. The youngest boy glanced back and froze. Emerging from the darkness was a figure, tall and faceless, holding an axe slick with blood, its head tilted unnaturally, as if studying them. Then it stepped forward. The truck roared to life, tires skidding on the dirt as the father floored the gas. The forest blurred into darkness, the crunch of gravel deafening in the tense silence. The youngest boy sat in the back seat, heart pounding as he dared to look out the rear window. Through the dust and darkness he saw it, a man standing perfectly still in the clearing, the bloodied axe dangling from his hand. His face was smooth, blank, completely devoid of features. He didn't chase. He didn't move. He simply stood there, staring as the truck disappeared into the shadows of the night. Years later, the boy, now a man, sits alone in his dimly lit room, staring out at the dark forest beyond his window. The memory haunts him still, vivid and unrelenting. He swears he hears it sometimes, the faint snap of a twig or the distant echo of chopping wood. He closes his eyes, but the image of that faceless figure with its bloody axe always returns. His hands tremble as he exhales, trying to convince himself it's over. But as he glances at the window, his breath catches. Reflected in the glass, standing just behind him, is the faceless man, silent and still. The fire crackled softly, its glow barely pushing back the darkness that surrounded us. We laughed, told stories, and tried to ignore the eerie silence beyond the trees. But something felt off. The air was too still, the forest too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Strange noises had been haunting our nights, soft rustling, distant whispers, and that awful scratching sound. We brushed it off, convincing ourselves it was just the wind. But deep down, we knew something was watching, and soon we'd realize how wrong we were to stay. Sleep wouldn't come easy that night. I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling, listening. The wind whispered through the trees, but beneath it, there was something else. A soft, deliberate scratching, slow and methodical, just outside. My heart pounded in my chest, each scrape sending chills down my spine. I reached for my flashlight, hands trembling, the air inside the tent thick with dread. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon. But deep down I knew better. Something was out there, something wrong, and it was getting closer. I reached out, my fingers fumbling for the flashlight beside me. The scratching outside grew louder, persistent, like nails dragging across fabric. My breath hitched as I clicked the light on, and for a split second, everything was still. Then, a shadow moved. A twisted shape pressed against the tent wall, its outline unnatural, its breathing ragged. I froze, my mind racing, fear locking me in place. The thin fabric separating us suddenly felt far too fragile. Whatever was out there, it knew I was awake, and it wasn't going anywhere. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, and I saw it. A face, if you could even call it that. Hollow, lifeless eyes stared back at me, sunken deep into a skull-like deer head. Its skin was stretched too tight, twisted and wrong, like something pretending to be alive. The moment the light hit it, an ear-piercing scream tore through the night, a sound like a woman crying out in agony, but distorted, inhuman. My blood ran cold as it bolted into the woods, moving in a way no living thing should. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The thing moved, fast, too fast. Its limbs jerked and twisted unnaturally as it disappeared into the trees, its shriek still ringing in my ears. My heart pounded as I sat frozen, gripping the flashlight like it could somehow protect me. The way it ran, it wasn't right. It wasn't like a deer. It was something pretending, something wearing a shape that didn't belong. I wanted to believe it was over, that it was gone. But deep inside, I knew better. Whatever it was, it had been watching us for days, and now it knew I had seen it. I sat in that tent until the sun came up, too afraid to move, too afraid to sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the forest made me flinch. My hands trembled as I stared at the torn fabric, a reminder that it wasn't just a nightmare. The others stirred, oblivious to what I had seen, what had been so close. Morning light filtered through the trees, but it didn't bring comfort. I knew it was still out there, lurking, waiting. And no matter how bright the day became, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Later, I started searching. Old newspaper clippings, online forums, anything that could explain what I saw. Stories of disappearances, strange sightings deep in the Nebraska woods. And then, I found it. The legends. The Wendigo. A creature of hunger and deception said to mimic the voices of the lost, to wear the skin of the familiar. But they weren't supposed to be here, not in Nebraska. And yet, I knew what I saw. The empty eyes, the broken movements, it was real. And worst of all, the stories all ended the same way. It always comes back. Even now, standing here in the daylight, the forest feels wrong. The trees sway gently, their leaves whispering secrets I can't quite hear. It looks peaceful, but I know better. I know what hides beneath the surface. I haven't heard the scratching since that night. Haven't seen those hollow eyes staring back at me. But I feel them, watching, waiting. They say time heals all wounds, But some things leave scars you can't see. And out here, alone with the trees, I can't help but wonder, what if it's still out there? What if it's never left? The forest stood silent, bathed in the pale glow of the moon. Towering pine trees stretched endlessly into the night sky, their shadows sprawling like dark tendrils over the ground. Camp Killiqua rested quietly in the heart of this wilderness, a cluster of rustic cabins glowing faintly in the distance, their warm light flickering against the oppressive darkness. A faint mist curled around the base of the trees, shifting as the wind whispered through the branches. The air carried a strange stillness, heavy and foreboding, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching, waiting for something to stir. The cabin stood nestled among the towering pines, its wooden walls weathered but inviting. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Laughter and chatter echoed as campers played near the entrance, their silhouettes glowing in the golden light. Yet, beyond the cabin's warm glow, the woods loomed darker, deeper, and unnervingly quiet. The breeze carried the faint scent of pine and earth, but there was something else in the air, a subtle tension, as though the trees were whispering secrets no one dared to hear. Emily's flashlight flickered weakly as she approached the outhouse, its wooden frame warped with age and neglect. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly in the cold night breeze. A small, cracked window reflected the dim moonlight, casting warped shadows on the forest floor. The surrounding bushes rustled softly, their movement unnatural in the oppressive stillness. Emily froze, her breath catching as the sound grew louder, then abruptly stopped. She strained her ears, but only the haunting silence of the woods remained. Dismissing it as her imagination, she stepped inside. The forest, however, seemed to hold its breath. Watching her, the campers trudged single file through the dense forest, their flashlights casting narrow beams of light that barely penetrated the darkness. The path was uneven, littered with fallen leaves and twisted roots that seemed to reach out like fingers. Above them, the trees formed a suffocating canopy, blotting out the stars. Their laughter was subdued, fading into uneasy silence as the forest grew darker and more oppressive. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her every step shadowed by something unseen. Somewhere in the distance, a twig snapped. She turned quickly, but the woods offered nothing but black emptiness. Inside the small, worn tent, silence pressed heavily against the thin fabric walls. The faint glow of moonlight seeped through, casting pale patterns on the wooden floor. Emily lay awake in her sleeping bag, her heart racing as she listened to the counselor's soft snores nearby. The rustling of leaves outside grew louder, an unsettling rhythm that felt deliberate. Shadows danced unnaturally on the tent walls, bending and twisting as if alive. She held her breath, every nerve on edge. For a moment, everything went still. Then the floor creaked, a sound so faint yet so close it sent chills through her. Emily woke abruptly, her heart pounding. The tent was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that pressed down like a weight. She tried to calm herself, brushing it off as a bad dream, but then she heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from the wooden floorboards just outside her sleeping bag. Her breath hitched as she turned her head, the moonlight filtering faintly through the tent's fabric. Shadows shifted at the edge of her vision. She blinked, and that's when she saw it. A figure stood just inside the tent, partially shrouded in darkness. Its head was grotesque, a deer's skull, twisted and unnatural, with empty eye sockets that glowed faintly, casting a sickly light. Antlers jutted out at awkward angles, resembling gnarled tree branches. But it wasn't the head that froze her in place. It was the legs. They were humanoid, long and bony, yet bent in ways no human could manage. The creature tilted its head as if studying her. Emily's body refused to move, her gaze locked with its hollow, glowing eyes. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Then, with deliberate slowness, it took a single step forward, the floor creaking beneath its weight. Emily's vision blurred and everything went black. Morning broke over the forest, sunlight streaming through the trees, bathing Camp Killiqua in a golden glow. The woods, so menacing under the cover of night, now seemed serene and peaceful. Birds chirped, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. Yet Emily sat at the picnic table, untouched by the morning's warmth. Her hands trembled as she clutched a steaming cup of tea, her pale face marked by dark circles under her eyes. Around her the camp buzzed with life, children laughing, counselors chatting, but their voices felt distant, muffled, as if coming from another world. She couldn't forget what she had seen. The creature's hollow eyes and the creak of the wooden floor beneath its feet. Emily tried to explain it to her counselor earlier, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush, but he had only chuckled, brushing it off as a nightmare born of an overactive imagination. "You've been reading too many ghost stories," he'd said, but Emily knew better. She could still feel the weight of its stare, the oppressive silence that had filled the tent. The forest seemed calmer now, but deep down she knew it was still watching. As the day faded, the forest once again slipped into its familiar shroud of twilight. The vibrant oranges and purples of the sunset melted into deep blues and grays, casting long, dark shadows across the forest floor. Camp Colloqua seemed quieter now, as if the energy of the day had been absorbed by the encroaching night. The breeze that had been playful earlier now felt colder, heavier, and carried with it an eerie stillness. The trees swayed gently, their branches creaking like ancient wooden bones. At first glance, the forest appeared peaceful, but something was off. The usual nighttime symphony of crickets and owls was gone, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Emily lingered near the edge of the camp, her eyes drawn toward the dense wall of trees. A nagging feeling tugged at her, a sense that the forest wasn't just silent, it was waiting. The bushes rustled faintly, just enough to catch her attention. She froze, her breath hitching as her eyes scanned the darkness. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate, before suddenly stopping. For a moment, nothing moved. The trees stood still, the air hung heavy, and the world felt as though it were holding its breath. Then, deep within the shadows, something shifted. It was subtle, just a glimmer of movement, barely perceptible. But Emily's heart raced. She took a step back, her pulse thundering in her ears. The darkness between the trees seemed alive, a void that grew deeper the longer she stared. As the last sliver of sunlight vanished, the forest reclaimed its dominance. The camera lingers on the shadowy trees before fading to black. The only sound is a faint, distant creak, as if the woods themselves exhaled. Something had stirred, and the forest would never feel the same again.